Our bodies run on rhythms. Many of us may think about our daily sleep-wake cycle, but there are actually many other daily rhythms that help regulate our physiology, from our hormones like cortisol to the daily rhythms in our individual organs. We all actually have a unique circadian cycle, dictated by this part of our brain. For some of us, our cycle is a little shorter than 24 hours. For some of us, it's a little longer than 24 hours. And your individual rhythm impacts so much of your health, your mood, your hormones throughout both the day and night. So in this video, we're going to run through some basics of our daily rhythms, and then we're actually going to call a circadian rhythm expert to get her take on how all of this relates to our sleep and mental health. By the end of this video, you'll learn how to make your unique circadian rhythm work in your favor. Let's get started. This video is sponsored by Notion. Hey guys, it's Robin and welcome to the Science of Self-Care. On this channel, we talk about health science, we talk about life philosophy, and we do a whole lot of self-care experimentation. We're sitting here in a dimly lit room because it is evening time on my end and I'm trying to wind down a little, but I'm also filming this in a rebound, and if you don't know what that means, you will very soon, because I am trying to lean into different parts of my day a little bit more. I'm so excited to get into the details of our daily cycles, aka our circadian rhythms. We're gonna go through what the heck our daily rhythms are, some interesting tips and takeaways from a book I just read, and we're gonna end this conversation actually talking to a circadian rhythm expert, Dr. Helen Burgess from the University of Michigan. We're gonna give her a call and we're gonna learn all about how our daily cycles relate to our sleep and our mental health. Whew! Okay, we have some great stuff to get into. So if you're someone who's looking to optimize your daily and nightly rhythms, then this is definitely the video for you. Let's get into it. So I recently started thinking about daily rhythms when I read this book, When: The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing by Daniel Pink. In this book, Pink explores the science of timing and reveals how structuring our day and activities around our natural rhythms can enhance our productivity, health, and overall well-being. This book really made me reflect on how I build my own day, so I'm going to run through a few key takeaways that can help us figure out how to master our own daily rhythm. Key learnings. The daily cycle. In this book, Pink outlines the typical daily cycle most people experience, which includes a peak in the morning, a trough in the afternoon, and a rebound in the evening. Now, about 1 in 4 of us are what he calls owls, people with a very late daily rhythm schedule. And according to the book, they actually experience their day a little bit differently. They start with a rebound, then hit a trough, and then enter their peak. These are people who basically get into their best state and their most productive energy at the end of the day. Regardless of your exact daily rhythm, Pink argues that the most important factor is whether you're synced up to your rhythm, and that means sleeping at the time your body naturally wants to sleep. We'll talk about chronotypes later in this video, and it's also about doing the specific types of tasks that align best with these different periods of the day. Our most difficult cognitive tasks should happen during our peak. Non-demanding tasks like errands or even rest breaks should happen in our trough, and our rebound is for things like emails and other work that doesn't require hyper-focus but still needs to get done. It's a great time for brainstorming or creative work that benefits from a bit of mental flexibility. Certain types of creative work are actually more effective when we're not so rigid and hyper-focused and we have this more diffusive cognitive state that can help us make really interesting connections that we wouldn't otherwise. In general, most people who follow the normal peak trough rebound pattern will experience their trough around 7 hours after waking. I really enjoyed reading this because I'm someone who is kind of useless in the afternoons, or at least that's how I feel. Around 2 o'clock, I just cannot compute. I kept berating myself, why can't I be more productive during this period? And lo and behold, there's actually signs to support why this is. It's a trough in my day, and since learning this, I've become a little bit kinder to myself. So here we are. I'm not filming in the afternoon. I'm actually filming in the evening, my rebound, which is working a lot better for me. I feel good. I just want to pause here to say that I don't use this daily cycle concept as a crutch. If I need to get something done in the afternoon, I'll get it done, but I have used it to be more effective in scheduling my day. The book emphasizes the importance of understanding one's unique chronotype in order to harness optimal times for focus, creativity, and decision-making. Chronotypes are people's natural internal clocks. We're going to get into this with Dr. Helen Burgess tomorrow, but essentially around 15% are what Pink calls larks, super early risers. They naturally wake up without an alarm. About 20% of people are owls, the super late night workers who really get a kick of energy and inspiration deep into the night. And then most of us, which is the group I fall into, are what Pink calls third birds, which is kind of middle of the road chronotype. Interestingly, in this book, Why We Sleep, author Matthew Walker argues that this is evolutionarily advantageous, that we all have different sleep cycles and some of us are kind of on a completely different rhythm, so that back way in our prehistoric past, there was always someone in our tribe who was awake and alert at different moments to help fend off predators and protect the group. So there would be the night owls that were staying up late and manning the fire, and then the larks would be up soon enough. And in that sense, the whole population would kind of spread out and be awake at all hours of the day and night. Okay, back to the other book we're talking about. I actually want to run through some really interesting little factoids from this book to exemplify the importance of syncing up with our natural daily cycle, choosing specific times to get different things done, specific times to sleep, specific times to go into deep work, specific times to exercise or socialize. So here are a few interesting facts from the book. Number 1, research shows that people are more prone to making mistakes during the afternoon trough. For example, medical professionals are more likely to make errors, and judges are more likely to give harsher sentences during this time of day. How wild is that? The author of this book actually writes how he will never take a medical appointment in the afternoon again after reading all this literature. There are certain times of day where the outcome of that doctor's practice or that judge's sentence will be different on average based on the time of day, which is pretty wild. 2, according to Pink, different times of day are better for different types of exercises. I was a little skeptical reading this part of the book, but I do think he makes some interesting points. He argues that morning fasted exercise is great for weight loss. I would agree with that. In general, if you exercise before you eat breakfast, you're more likely to tap into your fat stores. Obviously, you're also going to be tapping into your glycogen stores in your muscles. Sorry, I just choked on my own spit. Does anyone ever do that? But in general, for weight loss, moving before breakfast can be a great tool, which he discusses. It's actually something I do. Every single day I walk before I eat breakfast. It's a great way to start the day. He also argues that morning exercise is the best time if you want to improve your mood, because those endorphins, those feel-good chemicals will be with you throughout the day, rather than exercising at night and kind of wasting that feel-good energy in your sleep. According to statistics, the best time to exercise if you're looking to perform at your best is the afternoon. That is the time of day when most world records are broken. Apparently, afternoon exercise and evening exercise is also best if you're looking to avoid injury, because your muscles are already warm, you're flexible, you're less likely to injure your body. Next, let's talk about working with others and timing projects and collaborations. So for most of the working world, we're going to fall into this peak, trough, rebound pattern. But owls, again, about 1 in 4 of us are going to be a rebound, trough, and then peak. Understanding where your collaborators fall can be really helpful, especially if a lot of you are larks and third birds, because that morning time is the deep focus time. That is the time to not have kind of meaningless back and forth email exchanges and meaningless meetings, but to make really important decisions, to be super dialed in and do the focus work that later on is just not as accessible mentally. The afternoon, on the other hand, is a great time to have social, physical activity breaks, maybe taking a walk around if you're in a physical space with more people, and maybe even doing some social meetings then, or later towards the rebound, having interesting brainstorms when people are feeling a little more creative. Obviously, if you are an office full of owls, that schedule might look a little bit different, but I did like this point that being aware of what these schedules are of the people you work with can be really helpful. If you haven't read this book, I definitely recommend looking into it. In general, I think a really key takeaway is that we all have different rhythms, and I will put some resources down below to help you find your natural rhythm, you probably just by living in your body already have a little bit of an inkling, whether you're a super early morning person or a late night person, or you're kind of a middle of the road person like I am. Speaking of all of this, optimizing our productivity and daily rhythms, I want to share with you one of my favorite productivity softwares of all time. It's my second brain that I've been using for many years, and that is Notion, the sponsor of today's video. So I have slowly been collecting all my ideas in Notion because I'm a very visual person and I have all these ideas floating around up here, and if I use something like Google Docs, it just gets lost in the vortex. What I love so much about Notion is that it's so visual. I can use little emojis. I can literally drag and drop things and move things around. So here, for example, is a little book that I started writing. I don't know if I'm gonna publish this book. I feel like I have at least one book in me. There will be a book at some point, but this is one book I started writing, and I love writing it in Notion because of how easy it is to move things around, to move paragraphs around, to organize things, to go deeper, deeper, deeper. The reason I think Notion is the perfect second brain is that it's not only visual and intuitive to use, but Notion AI, which is a new feature that's just recently been launched. Notion AI allows you to easily search any part of your Notion, but also your Google Drive and your emails. So if you're wondering where you put something, or if you've created some sort of content on something, you can just ask Notion AI. Notion AI will help you find it, also help you brainstorm. So helpful for productivity. So that is why any future talks or books that I write, I will be writing, brainstorming, and creating within Notion. Notion also makes it so easy to create public pages and to share and collaborate with others. I've actually created a public template for 2025 goal setting, and this is what I'll be using this winter to set myself up for success in the new year. You can join me and check out this template by clicking on the link in my description. It's just my favorite software to host my second brain, my ideas, my creations, the things up here that I want to put out into the world. You can get started with Notion for free and unlock the new Notion AI for only $10 a month by clicking on this link in my description. Now let's get back to all things circadian rhythms. Okay, now that we've been yapping about this book, I hope you learned something interesting, but I'm going to start to actually wind down because tomorrow, during my peak period, we're going to be interviewing Dr. Burgess all about the science of chronotypes and how it relates to sleep quality and mental health. So I will continue to wind down here, and I will see you bright and early tomorrow morning on Zoom. Good morning. We are about to get deep into the fascinating details of circadian rhythms. If you don't have time to listen to our entire conversation, I'll add timestamps in the description box so you can listen to the questions that feel most relevant to you. All right, let's call Dr. Burgess. Hello, hello.
I'm Helen Burgess. I'm a professor in Department of Psychiatry at the University of Michigan. I co-direct the Sleep and Circadian Research Lab.
Firstly, thank you for joining us. I know you are busy. I think most people understand that sleep is important, but I'd love if you could share a little bit more about what we risk, physiologically speaking, when we deprioritize sleep, good quality sleep, and also enough sleep.
When we sleep, usually we sleep at nighttime, it's just providing an opportunity for the body to rest and repair. And this is affecting pretty much any system in the body that you can think of. And it's not just physiologically, obviously there's a psychological impact as well. We know it impacts the brain, the heart, the gastrointestinal system, huge impact on our immune system, significant impact on our mood, our cognitive performance, our hormones, pretty much anything you can think of. So when we don't have enough sleep, I feel like the easiest way to think about the sort of repercussions of that is that it's just additional stress that we've loaded onto ourselves, and we're out and about in our days and we're trying to deal with everything that's coming at us. And we're really just sort of, I don't know if sabotage is the right word, but we're really reducing our ability to respond to these things in a reasonable way. So it's adding stress to pretty much anything that we can think about.
Can you tell us a little bit, kind of summarize the research you do and also a little bit about the broader mission you have with the research that you do?
Yeah, I am a sleep researcher, but I specialize in circadian rhythms, and I feel incredibly fortunate to team up with different experts who are usually clinicians, but also researchers in different specific clinical disorders or with different clinical populations. And I learn an incredible amount from them, which is fantastic. They usually don't know a lot about sleep and circadian rhythms, so that's kind of where I come in. So right now, just to kind of give you a flavor for what we do, we have a study in bipolar disorder, we have a study in a chronic pain condition called fibromyalgia. We just wrapped up a study in PTSD, and we're also doing a study in people with inflammatory bowel disease. The first thing we do is we kind of go in and try and characterize the sleep and circadian disturbance. And depending on the disorder, we of course are looking at the literature as well. Sometimes other people have already done a lot of the work to help give us a sense of what's happening in this particular disorder. We come in and usually there is sleep and circadian disturbance, and we try and treat the sleep and circadian disruption usually through pretty simple methods, non-drug treatments. So we're focused on improving sleep, stabilizing sleep schedules, and then the main circadian treatment we've been investigating is morning light treatment.
So excited to get into all of this. So just to better understand, you're looking at these different disorders or physiological disturbances that people are experiencing and how that relates to circadian rhythm disturbances, and then how you can actually alleviate some of those issues through correcting circadian rhythm, predominantly through light, but maybe through other things as well.
Yes, and sometimes the sleep and circadian disturbance is part of the disease or the disorder. Sometimes it comes about through a pretty natural reaction of people when they get sick to withdraw from the environment. You know, what do we do when we feel sick? We go to bed, close the curtains, and that's our safe space. And, you know, that's really where we can try and start to feel better. But over a longer period of time, we're isolating ourselves from what we call the external light-dark cycle. We're maybe sleeping at odd hours, and that can actually feed back and cause some sleep and circadian disruption, which then, in some of our pain work, for example, we've talked about how that can increase symptom burden. And really make things worse. And I think a lot of the time people aren't aware of that. So coming in with pretty simple methods to try and reduce some of that, so far we've seen some pretty meaningful improvements in the disorder itself, but also sleep can improve, mood can improve, coping abilities can improve, things like that.
Really, really fascinating. You've started this conversation specifically talking about circadian rhythms, and I think sometimes colloquially people confuse circadian rhythms and sleep, and kind of they're the same thing when they are in fact very distinct. I would love if you could tell us a little bit more about the concept of a circadian rhythm, not just in our brain, but kind of systemically and cellularly. What is a circadian rhythm?
Yeah, I talked about sleep being one of the pillars of health, and from a purely circadian point of view, we would actually think of sleep as a circadian rhythm, something that happens usually at particular times of day. But the circadian system, our understanding of the circadian system has changed quite a bit, even in the time that I've been in the field, which has been pretty exciting. When I started in the field, there was certainly the acknowledgement that we have a circadian pacemaker or sort of timekeeper in our brain. It's in the hypothalamus.
Suprachiasmatic nucleus, correct?
Exactly, thank you. Suprachiasmatic nuclei, or the SCN. And that's about 20,000 neurons or so ticking away, and it's able to keep time. But one point that I'll make is that we all have different times. So we have something we call the circadian period, and we have different ways of doing this in the lab where we can measure how long it takes. So for me, how long does it take my internal clock to complete a full cycle? And my circadian period will be different from yours. We all have slightly different circadian periods. But that's the main circadian clock. What's new since I've been in the field is that we now know that there are little circadian clocks in almost every cell in the human body. These are what we call peripheral oscillators, and there's still a lot of work happening in the field about them. But I would say our general kind of model currently of how all of this comes together is that these little cells will sort of come together at the level of the organ and provide some sort of localized timing control. So you can imagine, let's say in the kidney or the liver, they've kind of come together And some of these peripheral oscillators, sort of depending on where they are, will respond to other local signals. And the one that people have really focused on is meal timing. So the timing of meals, that signal comes into the body, and if it's happening at a pretty regular basis, then these little peripheral clocks are kind of responding to that. But these clocks are still quite heavily influenced by the signal from the SCN in the brain. And that signal reaches those clocks through many different pathways. There's a lot of redundancy in the system, which I would speculate is a sign of just how important it is. There's the melatonin rhythm, there's changes in temperature, there's changes in cortisol. There's many different ways by which the central clock communicates to the rest of the body and sort of helps keep these peripheral oscillators in sync with the central clock. And where things get complicated in the field, I think, is still trying to grasp some of this and work out the best ways to measure it, is there's now different forms of circadian disruption. So you could have the central clock and the peripheral clocks aligned, but maybe just not timed at a good time relative to the external light-dark cycle. Or you could have one aligned to the light-dark, but the other one perhaps not aligned, and that's what we would refer to as internal circadian disruption. So there's more places now for things to kind of get out of sync with each other. But yeah, there's been a lot of interest in meal timing recently in the field with the recognition that this is now impacting these peripheral oscillators.
So cool. So I'm hearing there are different hubs. There's obviously the hub in the brain, but also individually in organs and specific cell types that are keeping time. And because there's so many different hubs, there's a lot of opportunity for misalignment, and that can cause issues in circadian disturbance. Very interesting. I have a follow-up question on, you said if you were to measure, and you do measure in your research, kind of a personalized circadian time span. Is that easy to measure? You hear a lot colloquially about chronotypes and people falling into different categories. How complicated is it to measure a single particular circadian loop, I guess? And what do you see kind of studying the specifics and individual variability?
First of all, to measure your circadian timing, and in some ways I would characterize this as just, even more so than phenotyping, you could almost imagine just taking a snapshot in time. So for example, today, where is your circadian clock at? Our kind of gold standard measure of that is the melatonin rhythm, which is not too hard to assess in the sense that we can measure melatonin in saliva. So we just take repeated saliva samples. Melatonin starts to be secreted roughly, there is a lot of individual variability, but roughly 2 or 3 hours before you normally fall asleep at night. And the one tricky aspect with melatonin is it's suppressed by light. So we bring people into the lab, although we've also been working on methods to try and enable people to do this in their home environment. But typically we bring people into the lab, they're in dim light, and we start sampling their saliva every half an hour, starting about 6 hours before they go to bed. So if they're going to bed at midnight, starting around 6 o'clock in the evening, and just sampling all the way up until their bedtime, and have the saliva assayed for melatonin levels. And we're looking for the point in time when melatonin starts to rise, because that's very tightly controlled by the SCN. The SCN sends a signal to the pineal gland and says, essentially, it's the start of the night, what we call the biological night. Now is the time to start secreting melatonin, and so the pineal does. So that's how we measure your circadian clock time. Cool. If we want to measure your circadian period, it gets even more complicated, because we will bring you into the lab and we'll measure your melatonin onset. We call it the dim light melatonin onset. And then we put you in very strange light-dark cycles. And we do that because when we put humans, sighted humans, into very unusual light-dark cycles, the internal clock doesn't really know what to do, and so it ends up running on its own internal period. So that's one way to kind of, in a way, force what we call free running of the internal period. And then we just track, we might let you free run for 2 or 3 days, and then we remeasure where your dim light melatonin onset is. We do sort of make an assumption that there's a linear drift across all those days, and there's some academic debate about that. But basically, we can see how fast do you drift across those days, and from that we can then calculate okay, how long is your own particular cycle?
In relation to kind of the 24 hours that we use.
Exactly.
So cool. I remember reading that these tests were done in complete darkness, kind of to completely free our brain from any sort of external cues. Is that true?
The original work, it's true. In the 80s, they put people down in these caves.
Yeah. I read that. Oh my goodness.
Because there is their perception of the day, which was related to their circadian clock. But then there's the 24-hour day, and you can imagine over a month or longer, people start losing days. But in the lab studies, we do allow people to be in light, but we put them in very unusual light-dark cycles. Some people will put people in a 28-hour day, for example, as opposed to the 24. That's such a different kind of day from 24 hours. Again, the clock just says, don't know what's happening there. I'm going to run on my own time. We've done studies where we put people in very short sort of days. So they might be in light for about 2.5 hours, and then we'll put them in dark for an hour, and then light for 2.5 hours, and then dark. And that's what we call an ultradian light-dark cycle. And again, the main aim is just put people in something that's so different from the 24-hour. It just kind of forces the system to run on its own.
So interesting. And to what extent is this variable across individuals? Is this concept of there being a very early chronotype, a middle of the road chronotype, and a late chronotype, is that an accurate reflection of what you see in your research?
I would say yes and no. Chronotype is something that we can measure with a questionnaire, and there's several questionnaires out there. The one I like the best kind of throws out different hypothetical situations. So it will say, you have an exam tomorrow. What time would you like to take the exam to really perform at your peak? And same thing for a physical challenge. It has lots of different questions. It also asks if you need an alarm clock to wake up every morning or not. When you wake up in the morning, are you hungry? An early bird, for example, someone with an earlier circadian phase is more likely to be hungry and want to eat breakfast in the morning. And using those questionnaires, you can sort of categorize people. Are they early chronotype? Are they kind of in the middle? Sometimes we call that intermediate or neither types. Or are they a late chronotype? We've published showing that they relate overall reasonably well. They correlate pretty well when we actually measure people's dim light melatonin onset, but there's still a lot of variability, and we can have people, so for example, I think we had a whole bunch of so-called neither types. So they're put in the same category, but we saw a span of about a 4-hour difference in the timing of their dim light melatonin onset.
Wow. So interesting. You've touched a little bit on this so far, but our physiology changes so much in that circadian cycle. You've talked about melatonin changing. What are some other things that are notable that change within 24 hours in our body?
Temperature, core body temperature changes a lot. Cortisol is a stress hormone, but also has a pretty significant circadian rhythm. Growth hormone also does. It's typically released during sleep at nighttime. The way I like to think of it is that there's pretty much an optimal circadian time for anything that you can think of. And one example that I think really kind of helps make the point is thinking, again, I'm kind of coming back to this food and meal timing, but imagine a snack or a small meal that you typically eat, you enjoy eating, and you eat that at a biologically appropriate time of, let's say, lunchtime. And when you eat that meal, you will typically see, if we measure your circulation, your blood, we'll see an increase in glucose after you've processed that meal, and that's pretty normal. We usually don't want to see a big spike in glucose or heightened glucose for a long period of time. We know that that increases risk for developing diabetes and things like that. What I personally find fascinating is that you can take that exact same meal that you ate at lunchtime with, a small uptick in glucose, it comes down, you're good to go. Eating that closer to, let's say, 9 or 10 o'clock at night, that's at a time when your body is not really as well equipped to be processing food. And what studies have shown in humans is the glucose peak will be larger, and it will also take longer to come down. So you're having precisely the same identical meal, this pretty different physiological response to that. And that's really because this activity is not happening at an appropriate circadian time.
Wow, so fascinating. So even our insulin sensitivity has this kind of circadian clock that it's following, and it's almost prepared to accept meals in the body at certain times and unprepared at other times. Oh, I love that so much. I think we're going to get into a lot of kind of practical things, but while we're on the topic of circadian rhythms, say someone has through their lifestyle or maybe their work schedule gotten a little bit off of their natural rhythm. Are there things that they can start to implement to kind of get back to their natural rhythm?
Yes. So our circadian timing is influenced obviously a lot by the timing of our internal clock, and that's largely genetically driven. So if both your parents were a night owl, it's a pretty high chance that you're going to be a night owl. But our circadian timing is also highly influenced by the strongest signal is light from the environment. There are some other signals, but by far the strongest environmental signal is light. Against your genetic background, you can use light. And I talk about sleep schedules as well, because typically when we're sleeping, we're in the dark and our eyes are closed. So sleep, when we regulate sleep, we're also regulating our light exposure. If we're running a little late, our cycles are a little later. This is true of a lot of us. And most of us are trying to match our cycles to not only the external light-dark cycle, but our social schedule as well. There's always that discussion that we're ruled by 3 clocks. Our lives are ruled by 3 clocks. There's the clock in the brain that I've been talking about. There's the external light-dark cycle, which is a clock. And then there's the clock on the wall that is saying you need to get up at 6 o'clock to get ready to go to work. So if you feel that you're a little misaligned and you're too late, which is the most common case, then to get earlier, you want morning light. Morning light will help you get earlier. And you can start nudging your sleep a little bit earlier as well. Now, the circadian system is pretty slow to respond. So this idea of like, tomorrow I'm going to get up 3 hours earlier, and, it just doesn't work that way. People usually know how easy it is for them to shift. So I would say anywhere between 15 minutes to 30 minutes a day, slowly start nudging yourself earlier until you get to where you would like to be. If you're a really late night owl and your genes are really driving that, then it's pretty unrealistic that you're going to be able to push yourself and maintain yourself as being a really early chronotype. And sometimes we sort of conceptualize that as swimming against the tide. You're just pushing, and it's going to be a lot of work. But certainly you can adjust yourself by a few hours, and you would have to maintain those behaviors to keep that clock time. Let's say you want to push yourself a little later, and this would be most applicable to older adults. As we age, we do tend to become more and more early. And sometimes they can complain, I'm falling asleep a little too early. Maybe I'm falling asleep at 7 p.m. and I'm losing some of those social evening hours, and I'm not getting to spend time with the family as much as I would like. In that situation, you actually want evening light. And evening light will push you later. So you have to kind of work out which direction you want to go. But again, it should be a pretty slow process with the sleep schedule and then making sure you're getting light at the right time.
You've mentioned the importance of morning light exposure if you want to kind of make your cycle a little bit earlier, which is what most people are probably struggling with, a cycle that's too late compared to their natural cycle. And you also mentioned changing the time you wake up by 15 or 30 minutes. Would you do that in conjunction with the morning light exposure, or do you do light first and then, okay?
I would do that in conjunction, because if you can imagine there's light signals coming in at all different times of day, the time relative to our own internal clock that we receive light can induce a completely opposite response. So a certain amount of light in the morning will push me earlier. That identical light, but I receive it in the evening, will push me later. And what we call in the field the crossover point between, when is light going to push me later versus shift me earlier, is roughly 2 or 3 hours before we normally wake up in the morning. So again, there's a risk if people try and push it too hard, and again, I'm going to wake up 3 hours earlier than normal and I'm going to get my light. Well, your brain could actually be interpreting that light as evening light, and it could be pushing you the wrong way. So we do a lot of light treatment trials, and our kind of rule is start the light treatment at your habitual wake time. If you need that hour or half hour in the morning to now fit it into your schedule, we do allow people to wake up half an hour or at the most an hour earlier. to fit it in, but that's the limit. Sometimes people say, well, I can fit light treatment in if I'm waking up 3 hours earlier than normal. And we say, we don't want to do that because there's a risk that we could make you worse. Start with just waking up at your habitual wake time, get the light. The more light, the better. We usually do 1 hour light treatments. And then the next day, see how you go if you shift everything, your wake time and the light treatment earlier by 15 minutes or half an hour. And of course, when you're shifting your wake time, you want to make sure you don't sleep deprive yourself. So you have to shift that bedtime earlier as well. So you're still getting the same amount of sleep.
Yeah. Is there a certain amount of light, lux, or anything that you kind of use to know what the perfect amount of light is? Is there a such thing as too much light? Is it best to go out in the sun, as some people say? I coincidentally happened to do 10 minutes meditation right when I wake up with a red light mask. I was doing it for skin benefits, but I've noticed over the years that it really helps me wake up and my mood in the morning. And so I'm wondering, is this mask light perhaps strong enough to have some of those benefits? I'd love to know, kind of from a measurement standpoint, how much light are we talking?
So the lab studies show us that brains will continue to respond to light. Our circadian system will continue to respond to light up to 4 hours long. And then after 4 hours, the effects saturate. For our light treatment studies, we do an hour because we think people are too busy. An hour is the absolute most. So duration-wise, it's about an hour. It turns out that the circadian system, the photoreceptors in the eyes, are most sensitive to blue wavelengths of light, which kind of makes sense because there's a lot of blue wavelengths out there in sunlight. So I would say if sunlight is available to you at the right time and it's not too cold, then sunlight is fantastic. Sunlight is the natural way to go. And it's great to go outside if there's a large window and there's a lot of light coming in through that window. Having breakfast in sunlight coming through the window should also be really effective, maybe working there for a while. If it's too cold or it's not convenient or it's not even light outside yet, people could think about a light device. The intensity of light, which we used to use lux a lot, and you'll still see lux everywhere as sort of an intensity measure, but that was developed before we learned that the circadian receptors are most sensitive to blue wavelengths of light.
I see.
So it's not just the overall brightness, it's also the wavelength. In terms of light boxes, they are certainly available, and we usually recommend the bigger the better because it's easier for you to kind of bask in the light. And then also they're going to appear less glary because it's a large light source and not this
spotlight.
Exactly. But in our light treatment trials, we started with light boxes and now we've moved to a wearable light device.
Oh, wow.
Which people love because you can get your light treatment while you're unloading the dishwasher, feeding the pet.
Are those glasses that I saw? I saw a picture of cool glasses.
There's different ones out there, different varieties. For our trials, we tested them all just internally. And the device that we use, and we do not have any financial relationship with the company at all, just to make that clear, is called the Retimer. It does look a little freaky. But essentially, there are blue-green LEDs, so it's a good wavelength for really stimulating those circadian photoreceptors, and they sit down here. And the Retimer, we use what is called the Retimer 2, just so people know Retimer has come out with a third version, which we just tested. We've decided not to use that one because what we love about the Retimer 2 is the nose piece is adjustable. So you can move it up and down, you can move it in and out, and it's just really useful for people with glasses, for example. We all have different shaped heads, and so we find that this allows us some movement to really best fit, and you know it's well fit when you see green light under your eyebrows. Like if this whole area is green, the light is reaching that.
So cool. So actually I'm hearing that my red light LED mask is probably not doing much because it's actually the blue light that matters most.
Yes, red light we're least sensitive to, but if the red light is quite bright, it could still be having an effect. If you have a stable sleep schedule and you're getting up around the same time every morning and your eyes are open, I would still think that there's some light signal reaching your brain. The regularity of that will be great and will feed back to your circadian system and help it just sort of stay stable.
Yeah, so not just the light exposure, but also doing that consistently at the same time every day is really going to help your body sync up. So cool.
When we have a nice stable circadian clock and it's at an appropriate time related to our external world, then we've really just optimized ourselves to be able to, again, just respond to all of those things that are happening during the day, to the food that's coming in, our immune systems, the immune challenges we might face during the day, mentally in response to the stress that's coming in. All of those things are just optimized. And so sometimes I talked about the pillars of health in the beginning. Sometimes people are like, well, how does the circadian system fit into that model of the pillars of health? It's a little corny, but we answer that by saying the circadian system is really the foundation of those three pillars of health. The circadian system will have an impact on the effect of exercise. We've talked about how it impacts diet and nutrition and the effects of that. And of course, it has a huge impact on sleep. So we don't really think about the circadian system very much. And sometimes in the circadian field, we gripe a little bit about sleep gets so much attention. What about the circadian system? But yeah, the circadian system, I mean, sometimes we worry that people overlook sleep. But the circadian system, I think, and the effects of that on us is overlooked even more. So,
well, hopefully this conversation, which I will not neglect to call the circadian system, will help. I also want to talk about another, I'll call it supplement, but you've also mentioned melatonin, this signaling molecule in our body that you've studied a lot, that is naturally occurring in our body in these cycles, but that people are also taking. So I know there's a lot of confusion about melatonin supplements. I would love to hear from your perspective as an expert. Are these helpful? Can they be helpful? Is there a certain amount to be taking, or should we just not be taking this exogenously at all? I would love to know your thoughts on melatonin.
So first of all, I just want to disclose that I am on the scientific advisory board for one of the supplement manufacturers, Natrol. So just kind of want to put that out there.
Thank you.
But I don't promote any particular brand. I think for me, how melatonin is used is best described sort of in three different categories. And I'll start with sleep, which, as you mentioned, is the most typically why people might use melatonin. A dose of melatonin, 3 or 5 milligrams, takes about half an hour or so to peak in your circulation, is very well established. It will help you fall asleep a little bit more quickly. Now, if it's an immediate release dose, it's not really going to do much else for the rest of your sleep. There are some studies that are looking at a sort of sustained release or slow release formulations in which the melatonin is slowly released across the night. Some of those studies suggest that maybe it does help reduce some awakenings at night. But melatonin is definitely not up there with the prescription hypnotics. It's not going to knock you out. You know, some people even say, don't call it a hypnotic, call it a soporific. But anyway, it will help you fall asleep more quickly. It may help you sleep during the night, maybe a little bit. And that's sort of one way and most common way that people use melatonin. Another way that people can use melatonin, and this is really, I think, only done within the circadian field, it's not really well known outside of that, is melatonin, when you take it exogenously or as a supplement, it gets in your circulation and it does bind to receptors on the SCN, and it will shift your rhythms if you happen to take it at the right time. And the tricky thing is when you take it. It's similar to light in that way. It's not effective as light in shifting your clock, but it does have an effect. And for this use, people recommend taking quite low doses because you'll need to take it during the day and you don't want the sleepiness side effect when you take it. If you want to shift earlier, for example, which is what most people use it for from a circadian point of view, you'll take the 0.5 milligrams about 5 hours before you normally fall asleep. And if you remember, that's actually a few hours earlier than when your own endogenous melatonin is increasing. And it's sort of tricking your circadian system in a way, because your circadian system will detect that melatonin has increased, be like, oh, I guess everything's a little earlier than I thought, and it will shift in response to that. I think the third reason, or third sort of category for melatonin, and the funny thing is people argue that this was probably the original use of melatonin, how it evolved, but we probably know the least about, research-wise, is with the higher doses, and now I'm talking 6 to 10 milligrams of melatonin. We are finding, and there is a literature, in people who at baseline have heightened inflammation through some sort of particular disorder, obesity, stress, things like that, 6 to 10 milligrams will decrease a lot of those inflammatory markers.
Wow, that is fascinating.
Yeah, and that we don't know yet. I haven't seen literature in pretty healthy people that have fairly low levels. What is melatonin going to do in that situation? Maybe nothing. But that is sort of the most recent emerging literature that it could potentially be an anti-inflammatory. I guess the other thing that people ask a lot about with melatonin is there's lots of different companies out there making it. And there have been studies in which they've sampled the melatonin and they found contaminants, pretty scary contaminants such as lead and stuff like that. They've also found that the dose is not accurate. And for that, I usually advise people to go with the bigger brands because they have the budget to do it, where they send their formulation out to an external lab to independently verify the purity and the dose. And when they agree to do that, there is a USP stamp that they'll put on their bottles showing, yes, this has been independently verified. And the larger brands will have that. And so I would recommend going with one of those.
So helpful. So when shopping for a melatonin supplement, making sure it has that USP stamp. I have a few follow-up questions because you mentioned some really interesting things. This anti-inflammatory use case of melatonin, would this be then taken at the same kind of time in the evening as if you were taking it at a lower dose for sleep aid, or when is that administered?
It's a good question. So far, the literature I've seen, they're taking it around the same time before bed. Where things do get a little controversial is if you're taking, for example, 3 to 5 milligrams to help you fall asleep faster in the evening. By the time you wake up 7-8 hours later, that supplemental melatonin has pretty much left your circulation. It's been metabolized. When you're taking a larger dose, such as 10 milligrams, there may be some residual melatonin in your system once you wake up. There's still debate over this. There's some people that believe you may feel slightly groggy if you still have some of the residual melatonin, but once you're up and about, you have that change in posture and the increase in sympathetic nervous system that kicks in once you're up and about, that will override that and you'll be fine. And there are some lab-based studies where they compared a high dose of melatonin versus placebo, and they looked for some of the sleepiness in these healthy people who were upright at that point, and they could not identify any differences between placebo and melatonin. But there's still a concern, and we do know actually that there is a high individual variability in how people metabolize supplemental melatonin. So I always just say to people, test it out. But in terms of the anti-inflammatory effect, don't take melatonin without at least talking to your primary care physician about it, because you could have a disorder that they wouldn't recommend it for. You could be taking other medications that could interact. So you really want to have that informed conversation with your primary care physician first. Outside of that, I think the 10 milligrams, the literature is still pretty new, and I'm not an inflammation expert, but some people tell me sometimes a bit of inflammation is not a bad thing. There can be situations where that's useful. So I wouldn't be coming in with a heavy hammer and just,
Yes, wise words.
I think I can disclose that I take melatonin every night, but more in that 3 to 5 milligram range. I take it about half an hour before my usual bedtime.
So 3 to 5 is kind of a normal range if you're not, just hoping to get to sleep quickly and get into a deep sleep.
Yes. The last thing I should say while we're talking about melatonin is it's very controversial in the use for kids. There is a pretty well-established literature showing that those kind of doses, 3 to 5 milligrams, can actually be very useful in helping to stabilize and improve sleep in children with neurodevelopmental disorders. That is very well established. I think where the controversy kicks in is for otherwise healthy children. Why would they need to take melatonin? And in the younger kids, a lot of the time, it's more of a behavioral issue. They don't have a regular bedtime routine. It's the easiest thing for the parent to be like, just take melatonin and make you sleepy. So that is really sort of discouraged. I think teenagers can use melatonin, but I would really say on a limited basis. Let's say they've had a vacation, they've drifted later, which we know teenagers do. Now they have to start thinking about, oh gosh, I've got school, I've got to get earlier. That's where you could start thinking about moving their sleep, getting the morning light. You can do morning light in combination with melatonin. You will get bigger phase shifts. They do add together. So there's a role for melatonin, but not long-term use. I really think short-term use is.
Is there a role for long-term use in adults? Because I've also read contradictory information about if you continue to take it, then you become too dependent on it, or this could mess up other endocrine systems in your body. So I'm just curious how much of that is kind of fear-mongering and how much is based in reality.
I think all the evidence we have in adults especially, they kind of joke with melatonin, the number one side effect is sleepiness. So, I mean, there are anecdotal reports. Some people say, oh, my dreams become too vivid. And again, there are some individual variabilities, which is kind of what your show is all about, right? But long-term use in adults, I don't think, and again, as long as it's a high-quality formulation, I don't think there's any evidence that it would harm you. And my own calculation was it's helping me a lot or it's helping me a little, and I don't believe it's harming me, which is why I take it every night.
I do take melatonin as well, and I notice a difference. I wake up alert and refreshed, feel like I've slept better.
It doesn't actually have a huge impact on our sleep stages. Prescribed hypnotic will. I do read and hear sometimes about people saying you have to be worried about tolerance, which is true with prescribed hypnotics, but that's not the case with melatonin. And I would agree it is somewhat surprising that you could take a hormone and not have it interact with your natural hormone levels, but there's no evidence that it does. There's no evidence that after taking melatonin long term you stop and somehow your own endogenous levels are impacted. There just isn't.
Wow. Very helpful. Thank you for sharing that. So you've done a lot of research on sleep disturbances in conditions like depression and PTSD. How does poor sleep and circadian disruption affect mental health? What is the relationship? I know you've mentioned a little bit that when you're maybe not feeling your best, you're also more likely to become reclusive and not have these other things like light exposure as part of your daily routine. But can you tell us more a little bit about the physiology there and if there are interactions between these conditions and sleep and circadian disruption?
There are some commonalities that we see across disorders. I'm not sure we've worked out kind of on a cellular level exactly how it all comes about, but we do know that when people drift later, they're more likely to start to show depressive symptoms. And we also know that when you take people who are later, if they have some depressive symptoms and you shift them earlier, that typically that has an antidepressant response. And that's commonly seen across a lot of disorders. So one is sort of the average timing, I guess. The other area that's been getting more attention in the field more recently has been this idea of regularity and night-to-night variability. And there are some disorders that bipolar depression, for example, inherent in that disorder is instability and variability. And we're doing a study right now actually looking at light sensitivity in people with bipolar disorder because there are a lot of melatonin suppression studies that started back in the 1980s suggesting that people with bipolar disorder 1 who've had a full manic episode, that their melatonin suppresses more in response to light than healthy controls, suggesting they're more sensitive to light. But when you use melatonin suppression as your measure of light sensitivity, you can only measure light sensitivity at nighttime. Kind of limits you because that's when melatonin is produced. So there's a newer measure in the field. So that was our first step with bipolar disorder. And we know, by the way, that bipolar disorder, many more people with bipolar disorder are late chronotypes, much more so than in the general population. So in that particular study, we thought our first step will be the sort of circadian mechanism of light. First of all, with this newer measure, let's go in and see, are they really more sensitive to light? And our hypothesis is that if they are more sensitive to light, that combined with the fact that their sleep tends to be more variable, could be really driving an instability in the circadian system, which is not helping mood. We know when there's that instability that mood suffers, general health suffers as well. So there's the overall timing. Usually later circadian timing is associated with depression. And then there's also the variability and instability. If we can stabilize things, that also tends to improve sleep and also mood.
It's really interesting to hear that kind of on average, when we shift our cycle a little bit earlier and we're experiencing depressive symptoms, that might be able to alleviate some of those depressive symptoms. Is there enough research and evidence to suggest that maybe everyone should kind of be veering on the earlier side of their natural cycle? Or is this really only for people who are struggling with clinical mental health issues?
I mean, I think it's really across the board. If we go back to the earlier part of our conversation where I talked about how we could measure each individual's circadian period, in those studies that we've done and other folks have done, we found the same thing. I will say we were measuring people, studying people who were kind of early 30s, healthy early 30s. And what we found was about 75% or so of people had a circadian period that was longer than 24 hours, which meant every day they need to shift that little bit earlier to stay in synchrony with the 24-hour day. And so for them, that's why morning light is so important, because it's their easiest way to shift a little bit earlier. But then there are those people who actually, well, there's the lucky people that their circadian period is right close to 24 hours, right? So they're kind of good to go from the outset. But there are some people who have a circadian period less than 24, and they're chronically early. That might sound like a great deal, but it isn't always the case, particularly for those wanting to stay up and have all those great social experiences that typically occur in the evening. And not just in older people. There are people, younger people with this genetic drive. And for them, it's the evening light that will push them later. So people usually have a sense of where they are. And if you want to get a sense of where you normally are, you can maybe look at how you sleep, possibly on the weekend, although of course on the weekend or days in which we don't work, our sleep will also be extended, usually because of some sleep deprivation that's built up. Other people say wait until your vacation to get a sense of how much you usually need. But I think most of us, we have to find that middle zone between what feels good for me, what feels natural for me, also fits into my work schedule, the social clock on the wall, and also allows me ideally to be getting some light during the day.
Yeah, I would love to dig into that a little bit more, because I do think the world that we live in is not always aligning with our individual natural cycle. Are there specific tips or tricks or things that you've seen in research or even discovered for yourself that you think is helpful for us in this modern day and age with so much technology to help support healthy circadian rhythms?
Yeah, I mean, there are, and it's always, I kind of feel like a little bit of a party pooper, right, in some of these things. But regular sleep schedule will really make all the difference. And honestly, I think if you're younger and you're healthy and you can kind of, lose a bit of sleep and be somewhat irregular and you can somewhat get away with it. But certainly as you age, you start to feel it. So the regular sleep schedule, getting 7 to 8, 9 hours a night, that's recommended by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. Try and keep that regular schedule even on the weekend. During the week, I'm normally up at 6:15. On the weekend, I might sleep 20 minutes later. I'm kind of lucky I have a cat that jumps on me at that time and says, feed me. And so I get up and I feed him. And then by the time I come back to bed, I don't need to sleep anymore, basically. So the regular sleep schedule at an appropriate time, getting enough sleep. I'm sure you've heard that we want to avoid the blue wavelengths of light in the evening. Have one colleague that says people don't understand that they're creating a mini sun in their bedrooms. So ideally, in a perfect world, none of us would really be looking at our phones in the hour or so before we went to bed. And of course, as a circadian person, I'm talking about all the light, but we know that there can be things online that people read that upset them, cause stress, and that's just going to interfere with sleep that night. That's not helping you prepare for sleep. But I can appreciate people find that very difficult. So certainly dimming down the lights. You'll see online, some people love blue blocker glasses, those orange glasses that block the blue wavelengths of light. I mean, as simple as just dimming your lights. I think some modern kitchens now are so incredibly bright, it's unbelievable. So just being a bit more aware in the few hours before your usual bedtime, hey, now's a great time to turn off all these lights I don't need and allow things to dim down. a little bit.
So things like night shift mode on my computer and my phone that do turn off the blue, that can be helpful. So if I do need to check something at the last moment, I can still minimize the exposure to blue light. I think in general, sleep is such a hot topic that there's also a lot of misinformation being shared. So I wanted to take a moment to ask you, are there any sleep myths that you really want to bust or dispel, that you feel like people keep saying this, but there's not actually any research to support it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you hear a lot of people talk about, I don't really need sleep now, and I can catch up on sleep later, and I can significantly sleep deprive myself during the week, and then I'll just catch up on the weekend. But of course, we know that doing that can backfire because, yes, you're catching up on some of the lost sleep. You never really fully catch up on what you've lost, but also you're now sleeping at irregular times, and so that's feeding back and kind of screwing up your circadian time. There's also the myth that people feel like, well, I can really tell if I'm tired, and I can go with 6 hours or less a night, which roughly a third of the population does regularly, and I'm okay. When I first started in the field, there were some really, really long-based studies happening where they brought healthy people into the lab, and some got 8 hours a night for like 2 or 3 months. Some got 6 hours a night, some got 4 hours, and so on. And the main researcher who was running all of these studies, he said, I can summarize our findings by saying, never believe what comes out of people's mouths when they talk about their sleepiness and how they're performing, because it seems, what's interesting is that it seems that when we're judging our level of sleepiness, we are really looking back on the previous week or so of how we've been feeling. So if we've been sleep deprived for a week, that kind of becomes our normal, and we tend to think, I'm okay, I'm performing well, things are really fine. But objectively, we see performance tanks. And so we are horrific judges of how well we're doing without sleep. And I think people really just don't know how bad a job we do at assessing that.
Is there anything I've missed in this conversation, something you wanted to touch upon that I maybe didn't ask you about?
I don't think so. I think we kind of covered a lot and a lot of the basics, and it might sound complicated, but really these are pretty simple interventions to do, trying to maintain the regular sleep, try and get the light. You know, sometimes it can be handy, and I think this is something that I think you encourage, is sometimes those daily diaries can be useful, and sometimes if people log their mood every day, that, you know, they can try some of these things and just log their mood before and after and do those experiments on themselves and get a sense of, well, how much is this helping me?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be a little bit more adamant about light exposure, because I'm realizing I don't get enough blue light in the morning. So that's something I'm taking away from this conversation. Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure, and I appreciate you sharing your expertise with us.
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me to talk about it. Bye.
I would love to know what your chronotype is, and what are you taking away from this video? Are you going to make any changes to your routine? Share with us down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.